The carriage rolled through the gatehouse arch on a gray November afternoon, the stone pillars black with old rain, the avenue of oaks stripped nearly bare. Colonel Ashford Penmore had not seen Penmore Hall in 4 years. He had not expected to feel anything upon seeing it. He had been wrong. It was not the house that stopped his breath. He had lived long enough with foreign skies that stone and slate had ceased to move him. It was the figure in the kitchen garden below the south terrace, kneeling beside a row of winter cabbages with her back to the drive, her dark wool gown spread in the mud, her bare hands working at the soil with the economy of someone who knew the ground well enough to read it without looking. She had not heard the carriage. She did not turn. He recognized her before the carriage stopped. The recognition moved through him like a blade finding an old scar. He said nothing. He let the groom open the door and descended onto the gravel and stood very still while the luggage was untied from the roof, watching the bent figure in the garden as a man watches a thing he has not permitted himself to think about for 4 years, and finds that the prohibition had accomplished nothing at all. The cold November air moved across the terrace and lifted a strand of dark hair at her nape, and she did not look up. She stood then. She pressed one hand briefly against the small of her back and turned toward the house, and her eyes found him from 60 yards across the autumn garden. She went perfectly still. Her face told him nothing. That was new, and it cost him more than he had expected. Then she turned away and walked toward the servants' entrance, and he had the impression not of a woman retreating, but of a woman concluding something. He did not know, not yet, what she was concluding. What he did not know was that by the time he crossed his own threshold, everything he had believed about Nora Croft had already been remade without him. In the 4 years of his absence, into something the laws of England would not allow him to undo. The story of how he had left and what had happened after requires more than a single winter afternoon to tell. It requires 4 years of absence, one grief-clouded decision made by a man who was not him, and a woman who had no say in any of it. Ashford had gone to the peninsula in the autumn of 1810. He had gone not from patriotism alone, though he would have said so at the time, and not from idleness, though his elder brother Julian's inheritance of Penmore Hall had left him with no particular fixed purpose. He had gone because staying would have required him to do something about Nora, and he had not known how. She had been at Penmore Hall for 2 years before his departure, hired as a housemaid at 17 by the old housekeeper, Mrs. Fawcett, on the strength of a character from the vicar of the nearby village of Aldwick, where Nora's father had been the schoolmaster before his death. The father had died of a fever in the winter of 1808, leaving her with an education that served no market the world recognized and a situation that required immediate remedy. Mrs. Fawcett had known the Aldwick vicar for 30 years and had trusted his recommendation. She had not been wrong to trust it. Nora was 19 when Ashford left. He was 28. The distance between those numbers, in 1810, in a house like Penmore Hall, was a distance measured not in years, but in the whole machinery of English society, a machinery as intricate and as impersonal as any clockwork, and considerably less forgiving of anyone who attempted to stop its gears. He had known it. He had observed it with perfect clarity, in the precise way that a man observes the bars of his own cage. He had watched her for 2 years, the neat economy of her movements, the way she read the household's temper each morning before any of them had spoken, the quality of her silence when Julian held forth at dinner about the improvements he intended to make to the East Wing. She was not invisible to him. She had never been invisible to him. That was the problem. He had left without telling her. He had told himself many things in the months of preparation and the long gray weeks of the crossing. That she deserved better than a second son with an officer's commission and no estate. That his interest was the selfish kind, and that acting on it would cost her far more than it would cost him. That 4 years in the field would settle him, sober him, redirect him toward something more suitable than the face of a housemaid in a November kitchen garden. He had rehearsed these arguments with the thoroughness of a man who suspects he is convincing no one, least of all himself. 4 years in the field had done none of those things. They had only made the image of her in a winter kitchen garden more precise. He entered the hall to find his brother Julian's steward, a thin, nervous man named Bellows, already waiting with the household register open in one hand and a look of careful preparation about him. Ashford shook the man's hand and performed the necessary introductions, and throughout the exchange he was aware, in the way he had been aware of enemy positions on certain ridgelines, of a particular name platted through the ledger entries he could see from where he stood. Penmore. In a hand he did not recognize. Julian was not in the hall. Julian, the steward explained with a rehearsed steadiness that suggested he had been told what to say and was saying it carefully, was in the library. He would join Colonel Penmore at dinner. Lady Penmore had retired early. Lady Penmore was not quite well. Ashford noted the steward's word. Lady. He changed out of his traveling clothes in the room that had been his since boyhood, the low room at the east end of the corridor with the window that looked out over the south garden. He stood at that window for a long time. The kitchen garden was empty in the failing light, the cabbages standing in their row like small, pale green sentinels, the dark soil between them freshly turned. Whoever had been kneeling there that afternoon had finished her work and was indoors. The window of the servants' hall was lit in the far corner of the kitchen block, and then, as he watched, it went dark too. He had no information. He had only the name the steward had used, and the way she had turned from him in the garden with the specific finality of a woman who knows exactly what she is walking toward. Dinner that evening established everything he had not yet been told, in the way that a room sometimes establishes itself before anyone has spoken. The arrangement of furniture and candlelight, announcing a change in the order of the world before any word has confirmed it. Julian entered the dining room at 7:30, looking well-fed and slightly sheepish, which was Julian's habitual expression when he had done something he expected to be called upon to justify. He had always been this way. As boys, this expression had meant a broken window or a borrowed horse returned lame. As a man of 41, it appeared to mean considerably more. Behind him, a step behind and to his left, walked Nora. She was no longer wearing wool. The gown was sage green, empire waist, with long gloves that covered the hands Ashford had seen bare in the garden that afternoon. Her dark hair was dressed high in the current style, with a few deliberate curls at the temples, the work of a lady's maid, and not, he thought, the work she would have chosen for herself. She wore no jewels, except a simple strand of garnets at her throat, deep red against the pale green, and she held herself with the careful uprightness of someone who had been told, more than once, that she was now a figure of consequence, and had not yet entirely decided whether she believed it. She was, in every particular of her dress, and in her position at Julian's left hand, Lady Penmore. Ashford did not look at his brother for a long moment. He looked at Nora. She met his gaze with the still, level attention of someone who had decided, before walking into this room, precisely how much she would show. She showed nothing that could be called an invitation. She showed nothing that could be called an apology. She let herself be seen, and she waited, with the patience of someone very well acquainted with waiting, to discover what he would do with what he saw. He pulled out his own chair and sat down. Julian said, with the particular warmth of a man who has rehearsed an announcement until it sounds natural. You will have gathered, Ash, that my circumstances have altered considerably since your departure. I have gathered something of the kind, Ashford said. He reached for his wine. His hand was steady. He was aware of Nora at the far end of the table, 20 feet away, her gloved hands resting in her lap with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for rooms to resolve themselves. Nora was good enough to accept my suit, Julian said. 18 months ago, in February of last year. We were married in March. I hope you will do us the honor of your good wishes. Ashford set down his wine glass. He looked at his brother. Julian was 41, rosy, well-meaning, and entirely without the capacity to read another person's face with any accuracy. He was looking at Ashford with the slightly anxious expression of a man waiting for a verdict he hopes will go his way. My congratulations, Ashford said. To you both. He did not look at Nora when he said it. He heard the small, precise sound of her exhale at the far end of the table. It told him almost nothing. Almost. If you have ever waited for someone to return and been remade entirely in the waiting, so that by the time they arrive you are no longer the person they left, you will understand something of what the next several days contained for both of them. He stayed. There was no polite mechanism for immediate departure that would not require explanation, and explanation was a thing he had no intention of offering. He walked the estate each morning with the steward, and reviewed the accounts and performed all the expected offices of a returned soldier visiting his elder brother's house. And in the evenings he sat in the drawing room while Julian read aloud from the newspaper, and Nora sat near the fire with her needlework in her lap, her needle moving in and out of the cloth with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. He watched her when he was certain she was not watching him. He noticed the way she anticipated Julian's requirements without being asked, the way she managed Mrs. Fawcett and the household staff with a quiet authority that had no trace of performance in it. He noticed the way she sometimes paused over her needlework and held very still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, before setting the needle to the cloth again. He could not have said what she was thinking in those pauses. She had not given him the right to know. She was careful with him. Not cold, not warm. Careful, in the way of a woman who has decided the terms of a new arrangement and is living by them without troubling anyone else with the details. It was Mrs. Fawcett who told him what he had not been able to bring himself to ask. She found him in the library on the third morning of his visit, under the pretense of inquiring whether his room required additional coals, and settled herself into the chair across from him with the authority of a woman who had managed Penmore Hall for 30 years and had seen enough of the Penmore family to have opinions about all of them. She did not ask for it, Mrs. Fawcett said, without preamble. Your brother made the offer within 6 months of your leaving. She refused him twice. He was persistent. He was also the master of the house, and she had nowhere else to go. And you had been gone 6 months without writing a word to her specifically. Ashford did not answer immediately. He looked at the fire. I wrote, he said. You wrote to Julian, Mrs. Fawcett said, not to her. He had no answer for that. He had known each time he had written that he was not writing to her. He had told himself it was because she was not a person to whom he had any established claim or social right. He saw now, with the particular clarity of someone who has arrived 4 years too late, that this had been cowardice dressed in the language of propriety, and that it had cost her something she could not have named and had not been permitted to refuse. She has been a good wife to him, Mrs. Fawcett said. She folded her hands in her lap. She has managed this house as well as any woman I have served under. And I have served under 3. She has not complained to any person in this household. She has not sought anyone's sympathy or asked for any accommodation beyond what was her due. She has behaved, in every regard, as Lady Penmore ought. "I know," Ashford said. "She told him," Mrs. Fawcett said, more quietly. "She told your brother, before the wedding, that she had once allowed herself to hope a certain officer would return. She was honest with him. He told her he could not speak for other men's hopes." The fire crackled. A log shifted and settled, sending a brief shower of sparks against the grate. "I see," Ashford said. Mrs. Fawcett rose. She set a hand briefly on the back of the chair between them, a gesture that was not quite comfort and not quite reproof, and left him to the fire and the books and the weight of 4 years of careful and deliberate absence. He sat for a long time after she had gone. The library was a room he had grown up in, its shelves arranged by no principle except that of long accumulation, his father's sermons alongside Julian's estate ledgers, alongside a collection of botanical drawings no one had ever explained. He had sat in this room as a boy and thought it contained everything knowable. He understood now that it contained nothing he needed. He saw what he had done. He saw it with the precision that comes only when all the comfortable misreadings have been exhausted, and there is nothing left to interpret in his favor. He had left a young woman with no means, no family, no shelter beyond the house of the man whose brother he was, and he had left without a word that could have given her any alternative. He had given himself 4 years to call this consideration. It was retreat. It had always been retreat. She had survived it. She had done more than survive it. She had built something real from the materials the world left her, and she had done it without a single letter from him to lean against. And it was good, and it was sturdy, and it held a man who was not him. He went to find her. She was in the morning room, alone. She was standing near the window overlooking the east lawn, holding a small book of botanical drawings, her thumb marking a page she had not been reading. The light from the window was winter light, pale and flat and very clear, the kind of light that shows things as they are, rather than as one might prefer them. She did not pretend surprise at his entrance. She simply turned and waited. "You told him," he said, "before the wedding, about me." "I told him the truth," she said. "I thought he deserved that." "What did you tell him exactly?" She set the book on the table beside her. She smoothed her skirt once, a small, unconscious gesture, and then her hands were still. "That I had not been indifferent to another member of this family. That the person in question had gone abroad without a word to me of any kind. That I did not know if I still felt what I had felt, or whether it was simply the shape of an absence I had learned to live inside." She paused. "I told him I could offer him honesty and faithfulness, and the best management I could give his household. I told him I could not promise that I had no history. He accepted those terms." He stood in the center of the morning room looking at her. She was 23 years old, and she had made a more precise and honest account of herself in a premarital interview with a man she had not loved than most people made of themselves in an entire lifetime. The garnets at her throat caught the pale winter light from the window and held it, deep red and slightly warm. "It was cowardice," he said. "My silence. I want you to know that I know it, and that I do not offer any excuse for it." Something shifted in her face. Not softening, precisely. A kind of recognition, careful and guarded, as if she was not yet certain what to do with it, or whether it was safe to do anything at all. "It was also fear," she said at last. "I know that too. I had 4 years to account for it." He almost spoke again. He stopped. The door was behind him, and through the wall beyond it were his brother's house, his brother's name, his brother's legal and moral claim, and a world in which the thing he felt, and the thing the law and the church and every convention of English society permitted him to act on, were two entirely separate countries with no passage between them. "You are happy?" he said. The question came out more plainly than he had intended. She considered it with the same gravity with which she had considered everything since his return. "I am contented," she said. "That is not the same thing." He went to stand near the window, at the correct distance from her, close enough that he could see the slight irregularity of her breathing, the small contained rise and fall of it. Her hands were still. Her hands were always still. "I will leave next week," he said. "I know." "That is not a declaration of any kind," he said. "I mean only that you should not be obliged to manage my presence here indefinitely." "I know that too," she said. They stood together for a moment, side by side at the window, looking out at the east lawn where the grass had gone gray-green in the November light, and a pair of sparrows sat on the stone balustrade before the cold lifted them away. The winter sky above the lawn was low and gray and faintly luminous, the kind of sky that holds light without releasing it. It was then that Julian appeared in the doorway. He stood in the threshold with his hand on the frame and looked at the two of them standing side by side near the window, and the sheepish expression that was his habitual mask was entirely gone. In its place was something Ashford had not seen on his brother's face in 30 years of knowing it. A quiet, still recognition. The face of a man who had been told a truth 18 months ago and had said he could accept it, and was only now arriving at the full dimensions of what he had accepted. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Ash." "Julian?" Ashford said. Julian came into the room slowly. He moved to the chair nearest the window and sat down heavily. Not in his usual well-padded way, but as a man sits when the energy required for the ordinary performance of himself has simply departed and left him with only whatever he actually is underneath it. "How long?" he said. Not angrily, not accusingly. He asked it as a man asks about a number he requires in order to reckon correctly. "Since before I left," Ashford said. "Nothing happened. Nothing of any kind was said or done. I was not indifferent to her, and I chose departure over honesty, and that is the full account of it." Julian was quiet for some time. Nora had not moved from her place near the window. She stood with her hands folded before her, her eyes on a fixed point in the middle distance of the east lawn, and her face gave nothing away that she had not chosen in advance to give. She had become, Ashford understood, very good at this. 4 years of service and 1.5 years of marriage had given her practice in the management of rooms that required her composure as a precondition of their functioning. "She told me," Julian said finally. "Before we were married, she told me. I may not have understood precisely what she told me." "You understood well enough," Nora said. "I was plain." Julian looked at his wife. He looked at her for a long time, with the expression of a man revising an account he thought he had already closed, and Ashford looked at the floor, because that particular expression, and the particular woman it was directed at, were not things that belonged to him, and he was aware of it with every breath he took in that room. "I would not have wished things otherwise," Julian said at last, slowly, as if taking the measure of each word as he set it down. "That is the truth. I would not have her be elsewhere. And yet—" He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at the window and the gray lawn beyond it. Nora crossed the room. She sat in the chair beside Julian and put one of her gloved hands over his on the chair arm, with the steadiness of a woman who understands that comfort can be an honest gift, even between people who did not arrive at each other by the simplest or most natural road. "I know," she said. Ashford left the room. He stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand against the paneled wall, listening to his own breathing, ordering himself as he had learned to order himself on certain mornings in the peninsula when the situation required clarity rather than feeling. He had been a soldier for 4 years. He had learned to take account of ground as it existed rather than as he wished it to exist, and to act accordingly. The ground here was plain enough. She was Julian's wife. She was contented, which was not happiness, and she had said so without reproach, because she was constitutionally incapable of reproach that was not deserved. She had given her honesty to Julian as a form of respect, and Julian had accepted it without knowing its full weight, and it had built something real between them. The kind of daily trust that holds a house together even when the heart that entered it was not, at the outset, entirely free. He was leaving next week. He went upstairs and sat at the writing desk in his old room. He remained there for a long time, looking out at the darkening garden and not writing anything. Then he took a sheet of paper and began. Not to Julian. Not to Nora. To the War Office, requesting an extension of his commission. There was no dishonor in it. There was, he thought, a kind of honesty. The acknowledgement that his presence in this house, at this proximity, for any extended period, served no one's interest, and least of all, hers. He was a complication she had not asked for, and had managed with more grace than he deserved. He sealed the letter and set it on the corner of the desk. He looked at the window, where the November garden had gone fully dark, the stone balustrade just visible in the last light from the house. He thought of her kneeling in the kitchen garden that afternoon, the dark wool gown and the bare hands, the small press of one hand against her back when she rose. He thought of the way she had turned and found him across 60 yards of autumn ground and had shown him nothing he had not earned the right to see. The anchor was that moment. Not a letter, or a folded card, or any object he could carry. Simply that. She had turned, and she had seen him, and she had shown him a face that gave nothing away, and in the giving away of nothing it had told him everything. She had survived. She had built. She was not diminished. She was not waiting. He should not have needed to be told. He had told himself 4 years ago that he was leaving for her benefit, acting in her interest, removing himself rather than impose on her a situation that could only cost her. He saw now what an efficient piece of self-deception that had been. Acting in a person's interest required knowing what they needed. He had not asked. He had assumed from a comfortable distance that his silence was a gift. It had not been a gift. It had been an absence she had had to survive. She had survived it. That was the kind of woman she was. And he had known it for 6 years. And it was the very thing that had made leaving feel permissible, when it had not been permissible at all. The evening of his last full day at Penmore Hall was a Friday. The sky had cleared for the first time since his arrival, and the low autumn sun came across the estate in long golden bars that made the limestone glow and turned the bare oaks along the avenue to something almost burnished. Dinner was quiet in the way that rooms sometimes go quiet after a storm has passed without the damage anyone feared. Julian was composed. He spoke of the estate, of the enclosure of the north field that was proceeding in the spring, of a letter he had received from an acquaintance in Shropshire about a new drainage system that was said to do wonders for clay soil. He spoke of these things with the slightly effortful naturalness of a man who has decided, in the clearest terms, to continue, and is continuing. Nora listened and answered, and passed the salt, and refilled Julian's glass from the decanter at her elbow, all with the same unhurried precision she brought to every office she performed in that house. He watched her and ate his dinner and said the correct things at the correct intervals, and understood, as clearly as he had understood anything in 4 years of campaign, that the life she was building here was real, and was hers, and had to be honored. And that honoring it was the only thing left in his power to do. That is a particular kind of grief. It does not announce itself. It sits beside you at a well-appointed dinner table and passes the salt without being asked, and it is present in every small, competent motion of a pair of hands that once worked bare in November mud, and it does not hurt less for being entirely of your own making. He found her in the library the following morning, the last one. He had not planned to seek her out. He had been going to the stables to speak to the groom about his horse's shoe, which had been reported slightly loose, and the library door had been open as he passed, and she had been inside, standing at the shelves with a book in her hand, not reading it, looking at a fixed point on the middle shelf as if the book were simply something to hold, while she thought. He stopped in the doorway. She turned. "I have written to extend my commission," he said. "I know." She set the book back on the shelf. "Julian told me this morning." "It is the correct thing." "Yes," she said. "It is." She did not turn away immediately. She stood with her back to the shelves and her hands at her sides, and she looked at him with the same clear, unguarded attention he had seen on her face only once before, in the moment in the garden when she had first turned and found him standing on the gravel of his own driveway. It lasted only a moment. Then she looked down, and when she looked up again, she was composed. "I would have waited," she said, "if there had been a letter. One letter. Something that named what was between us, even without certainty, even without any promise. I would have waited." He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the space between them did not already contain. "I am not saying it to reproach you," she said. "I am saying it because it is true, and it ought to be said once, and then not carried unspoken any longer. For either of us." The morning light from the tall library windows lay across the floorboards between them in long, warm squares. He stood in one of them, and she stood in another, and 6 feet of well-lit Regency floorboards separated them, and it was not the kind of distance that could be crossed. She knew that. So did he. "It is said," he told her. She nodded, one small, certain motion. "Then go well," she said. "Write to your brother. He is a better man than he is generally credited with being, and he would be glad of your letters." It was not a dismissal. It was a release, the particular kind that costs the person who gives it exactly as much as it costs the person who receives it and asks for nothing in return, not gratitude or acknowledgement or even recognition of the gift. He understood, standing in the library in the November morning light, that this quality in her was not a performance, and had never been a performance. It was simply what she was. He had seen it 6 years ago in a kitchen corridor, and had not known what to do with it. And he had chosen the easiest thing, which was departure. And she had done what she had always done, which was to survive the consequences of other people's choices. He left the library. He made his farewells to Julian in the front hall, while the groom brought his horse round to the steps. Julian shook his hand with the careful warmth of a man who is holding several truths in balance simultaneously, and managing it by sheer force of decency, which was, Ashford thought, a quality he had underestimated in his brother for 30 years. "She spoke of you," Julian said, looking at the groom rather than at Ashford, his voice measured and deliberate. "Early on, before we were married, not with longing, with something more careful than longing. I understood she was telling me something about her own nature. She was honest, Ashford said. Yes, Julian said. She is. Ashford mounted. He looked down at his brother in the pale November light. Julian was looking up at him with an expression that was not quite equanimity, and not quite grief, and was, in the end, simply the face of a man who has chosen to be fair, and is being fair, as well as he knows how. You chose well, Ashford said. Both of you. He rode down the avenue of oaks without looking back at the house. The oaks were nearly bare above him, a few last brown leaves turning in the cold air at the edge of his vision. The hooves of his horse rang on the hard November ground. He looked ahead, at the arch of the gatehouse and the gray road beyond it, and the flat fields opening under a sky that was very pale and very wide, and offered nothing in the way of comfort, and everything in the way of direction. He had sent no letter. He was sending himself now toward the only thing left that he could do honorably, which was to be elsewhere. That winter he wrote to Julian from his posting, long letters about the landscape and the men and the particular quality of Spanish light in the early morning, the way it came over the hills an hour before the heat arrived and made everything look briefly like a painting of itself. Julian read the letters aloud to Nora over supper, as couples who have settled into each other do, sharing what comes in rather than sorting it first into what belongs to whom. Nora listened. She said, one evening in February, folding a napkin at the end of supper, while the fire in the dining-room grate burned low, that he wrote well, that the letters had the quality of someone who had learned to look at things precisely. Julian said, he always had that, even as a boy. He saw what the rest of us were looking directly at, and still managed to miss. Nora set the folded napkin beside her plate. She did not answer. She looked at the fire for a moment, at the low, warm orange of it in the grate, and then she rose from the table and helped Mrs. Fawcett clear the remaining things, in the way she sometimes still did when the evening was small and informal. Not because she was required to, but because she had learned her useful habits in a schoolmaster's house and did not see the sense in abandoning them now. In the spring, she began to read her way systematically through the Penmore Library. She started with the botanical drawings and moved on through the natural history and then into the more recent poetry, working steadily and without any particular haste. She made notes in a small leather notebook Julian had given her for the purpose. In the evenings, she walked in the kitchen garden when the weather permitted, her hands knowing the ground in the early spring dark, the soil already warming under the surface. She had arranged her life around what was real: the house, the garden, the man who came home each evening and read to her and was good, the slow and unglamorous accumulation of days that, taken together, made something she did not regret. She did not arrange her days around any absence or any hope she had not decided was sensible. She was 23 years old, and she had made her honest account, and she had received an honest account in return, and she had chosen to proceed. She proceeded. There is a small oval miniature in the Penmore Hall Library, hung on the south-facing wall between a print of a lapwing and a watercolor of the Aldwych Valley. It depicts a young officer in a militia uniform, done in the years before the peninsula, the face in it serious and a little younger than the man who had ridden down the avenue of oaks the previous November. Julian had placed it there without ceremony and had not spoken of it. Nora dusted it once a week with the cloth she used on all the objects on that shelf, moving from the lapwing to the miniature to the Aldwych Valley with the same unhurried care. She kept it clean. She did not turn it to the wall. That is the fullest account of her, and it is the truest one available. She had been seen once by someone whose seeing had been real enough to keep him 4 years from admitting it, and real enough to cost him the thing he had hoped leaving would preserve. which was the ability to pretend he did not know his own heart. She had survived the absence of that seeing. She had not been rescued. She had not been avenged. She had built, from the materials the world provided, a life that was contented, and contented was a word she had chosen herself and continued to hold, not as a consolation prize, but as a thing with its own specific value that she understood and would not diminish. The spring came, and then the summer, and then another autumn. The kitchen garden was turned and replanted and turned again. The east wing of Penmore Hall received new glazing in October, a project Julian had deferred for 3 years and finally authorized, and the difference it made to the morning room was considerable. Nora noticed, one morning in November, that the light from the improved east window had changed the color of the botanical drawings on the opposite wall, making them warmer and more precise. She wrote this observation in her notebook. She was not sure why it seemed worth noting, except that she had been told once that she had a quality of attention that was rarer than it appeared, and she had decided to trust that this was true. The letter Ashford sent, in the spring of his 2nd year at the posting, was addressed to them both. It described a pass in the mountains at the hour before dawn, the particular quality of darkness in that country at that hour, the silence of it, and the way the first light, when it came, was not gold, but a pale, clear gray that turned the stone an unexpected color she would not have guessed at from a painting. He wrote that he had been attempting to learn to see things as they were, rather than as he preferred them to be, and that the mountains were a reasonable school for this. Having no particular interest in being misread, Nora read the letter by the east window in the morning room, in the improved November light, and she sat with it in her hands for a moment after she had finished it, and felt the exact shape of the life she had made, its edges and its weight, the specific dimensions of its center. Then she went to find Julian to read it to him, because it was his letter too, because reading aloud together in the evenings was the shape of what they were, and she had chosen that shape and kept it. The sparrows were back on the stone balustrade outside the east window. She could see them from where she walked through the hall toward the sound of Julian's voice in the breakfast room. 2 small brown sparrows on the pale November stone, and the morning light was clear and clean across the lawns, and the floor of Penmore Hall was solid under her feet, and the house was warm around her, and she had made it so. She was not waiting. She never had been. That was the whole of her courage, and it was enough.